Indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the committee meeting, and let's start off with a roll call.
Awesome, thank you. Fredson,
Here.
Sterner. Acknowledging I do not see Sterner in our attendee list yet, but I will monitor for him to join us. Vento,
Here.
Wolf,
Here.
Zarin,
Present.
and Lindstrom.
Present as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that takes us to the reading of the chair's statement, which we do every meeting when we meet virtually, which is that the Met Council chair has determined it is not practical or prudent to conduct in-person meetings in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Accordingly, committee members are participating in this meeting via telephone or other electronic means, and the meeting will be conducted under Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021. And we encourage everybody to monitor the meeting remotely and submit comments to public.info@met.state.mn.us. So with that, that takes us to the approval of the agenda. So without objection, we can move forward with this agenda. Next up would be the approval of the minutes. It's been a while, November 9th, 2021. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
Wolf moves approval.
Thank you. Second?
Vento seconds.
Thanks. Roll call.
Fredson,
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Zarin,
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Thank you.
You bet. Just two items on our consent agenda today. The City of Shoreview comp plan and comprehensive sewer plan, and as well as the City of North Oaks comp plan and comprehensive sewer plan. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
President will move approval.
Wolf seconds.
Excellent. Roll call.
Fredson,
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Zarin,
Aye.
and Lindstrom.
Aye.
Thank you.
That may have set a record for going through the first 6 items on our agenda. We don't have any items on our non-consent agenda today, so that takes us to our first information item, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about, the 2020-2021 Water Resources Monitoring Update.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I wanted to acknowledge that Councilmember Sterner has joined the meeting.
Fantastic. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Susan.
All right. I think I'm up. Excited to be here for this informational item. We've done this in the past as a update on activities. Here you're getting a 2-year version of this, 2020, and some updates on 2021. There's a couple different, unique things for these years. We have some interesting, impacts on our work from the pandemic, as well as the drought we had in 2021. So going to share some of these updates of what we're seeing in our water resources monitoring and some assessment work that we're doing. Next slide, please. So this is just an overall timeline focusing mostly on 2020 and some of the pandemic pieces, the stay-at-home order, which we do work that is permit related and some that is not directly related to a wastewater treatment plant permit. And so we did pause some of those activities, especially during the stay-at-home order. So we were able to resume some of that after that March through May hiatus. Some of the impacts was significantly felt on our lake program. We did postpone some of our staff-run monitoring, which we do several lakes a year. due to some social distancing concerns at the time. But we were able to work with our local partners, communities, watershed districts, counties who participate in our volunteer lake monitoring program, citizen-assisted monitoring program, often referred to as CAMP. And those are, single families or single individuals in their own watercraft coming off their dock, and so they were able to do that safely. So that persisted through 2020, so that was great to see, and I'll be sharing some results from that. And some other work, we do biological monitoring of like aquatic insects, macroinvertebrates, and so that was something we were able to continue to do in 2020. Some of the work that we usually do on our larger rivers, our receiving waters, the Mississippi, Minnesota, St. Croix, that was put on hold again due to some concerns about boats. But in 2021, as you'll see, we were able to resume some of that. All of the boat monitoring was able to resume due to some better understanding and personal protective equipment, and evaluating how we can monitor a boat. And we work closely with state agency partners at the DNR and PCA as well to kind of determine those safety protocols for boat monitoring. That's a general timeline. Next slide, please. So starting off with our lakes, I kind of covered a little bit in my intro, but the pictures you see there, we were able to get an intern in the upper right there in 2021 to help us out, and he was great. The picture at the bottom there is one of our quintessential pictures for our volunteer monitoring. So just somebody in a paddle boat can get out there and do some monitoring for us, which was again critical, especially in 2020. We also, when we resumed some of that monitoring in 2021 of our staff monitoring, we were able to partner with the PCA on 3 lakes as part of their kind of longer term, their cycle monitoring where they're looking for impairments. So that was something that was unique to that year, is that we usually, or it's not every year you partner with them on those lakes, that they were able to provide some funding as well. Some interesting kind of storylines from the drought this past year. We had a couple examples from staff monitoring where the landing is 20, 30, 40, 50 feet out of just mud and muck that you normally can just launch a canoe. And so you're kind of walking through some shoreline that wasn't there in the past due to some of the drought. And that was a pretty common thing across the region for lakes is, the shorelines, people are having to extend docks. And that was something that we definitely saw through our monitoring work. Next slide, please. So every year we put out lake grades. This is our 2020 lake grades, and I've shared this in the past, but so there's a few lakes maybe not on here that we normally would have added with our staff monitoring. But we were able to produce this product and get these lake grades out to our participants of that citizen-assisted monitoring program. And so that was great to see. The enrollment in that program was pretty strong through 2020, and we'll be working on putting together a similar map for the 2021, which had another strong year for our volunteer program as well as our staff monitoring program. But in the lower left, you can kind of see our grading curve there, which is very similar to previous years. So we've got a lot of strong lakes in the metro area. Next slide, please. Moving on to our large river program. And I've given some overviews of this, so I'm kind of going fast through this, so feel free to ask questions about our programs as well. But we do river monitoring year-round. This is staff-led, and I wanted to make some highlights that we had throughout the pandemic as far as creative solutions, and especially when we were trying to limit time on site. We work our field crews out of the Metro plant, and so we wanted to make sure we were being as protective as we could of everyone that was working on site. So staff were doing some things like calibrating meters in their sink at home, which you can do as long as you do the right prep and bring your solutions home. And so there was a lot of that going around, and people were really flexible, which was great to see. And we were able to resume that river biological monitoring this past year, where we deploy some equipment that they're on buoys essentially that are anchored to the bottom, and they collect some aquatic insect macroinvertebrates. And so we were able to get some of that data this year, which will be interesting to get results back because it was such a drought year that it'll be interesting to see what those results show. And I'll get into this a little bit more later, but we also do, in addition to just normal grab sampling where you're getting a bottle of water out of the river. We also have some continuous sensors deployed, which again was I'll get into some details because it's an interesting story this past summer with the drought. Slide. So the drought, if you're following the news cycle, this is maybe a recap, but we had a huge drought. And this is, I kind of picked out some highlighted dates here from the drought index. But what I thought this really showed was, if you look at the Mississippi River upper basin there, the kind of fish hook up in north central Minnesota, it really just gets enveloped in this extreme drought over the course, especially in that August picture, you can see it. And so that is just really why the Mississippi River was really hit hard. You definitely saw the drought in the Minnesota and the St. Croix as well, but just really significantly low flows coming out of the Mississippi River, and this drought was the primary driver. This June through September time range is something that when I'm sharing some of these water quality results for our rivers and streams, we're really kind of looking at that June through September time range, because that was definitely the drought period. So something to think about. Next slide. So we looked at some of the large river data out of our stations. So the dots here are where we have monitoring locations. On the left-hand side there, phosphorus, where the green indicates is that if it was below the water quality standard, red is exceeding the water quality standard. So this doesn't mean it was impaired or not impaired, but just looking at that criteria, was it above it or was it below it? And low flows, drought year, there's not a lot of runoff. We've been making great strides in our treatment plants and phosphorus control and non-point as well with watershed management. There's a lot of green dots there, and so that was good to see in our large rivers that coming into the metro, there's still some challenges. Maybe you can see some of the red dots on the Minnesota River coming in. We did see one blip there up down by Hastings, by the city of Hastings, but phosphorus levels overall during that, again, this period of June through September was actually pretty well, faring pretty well, especially in the metro area. Looking at chlorophyll A, which is a kind of surrogate for algal growth. We talk a lot about algae blooms and whatnot. This is a type of metric for that. And so in the metro region, we saw a lot of that exceeding its water quality standard. You get a little bit of a dilution effect from the St. Croix River there. And so some of the greens below that confluence, which is good to see. And again, this doesn't mean it's impaired or not impaired. The kind of formula for impairment is pretty complicated. The phosphorus is kind of the primary, and the chlorophyll algae piece of it is a little bit secondary, but it's definitely something that responded to the low flows of the drought. As we saw algae, growing in pretty high numbers. What exactly was the driver besides that low flow? We have to dig into some data and maybe talk with the PCA a little bit more about that. But phosphorus was looking pretty good, so those are two things that we usually look at right away. So that was great to see. But that's kind of the story that we have so far. Happy to take questions now, or if there's time at the end too. If there's any while we have this up, feel free. Not, we can keep going. Next slide.
Dan, I got a question of how many citizen volunteers do we have? And it's up to us to recruit those folks as well, is that correct?
Yep, I'd have to get back on the exact number of volunteers. I do know as far as, lakes, we monitored 178. So, as far some sponsor, because we have different partners. So as far as enrollment goes, we work with a city community on what their lakes of concern are. They might have 5 volunteers or 2. We'd have to look at that list, but I do know we had 178. So
178 lakes?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Cool.
Okay, I think we can go to the next slide, slide 8. So this is one of the pieces I was mentioning before as far as our continuous river monitoring stations. Our metro plant discharged to the Mississippi River, and so we have continuous dissolved oxygen monitoring on the Mississippi River, which dissolved oxygen is what aquatic organisms need to live, and so it's of utmost importance during droughts when water can stagnate and get quite shallow and just not moving anywhere. So the kind of cluster of blue, red, and purple lines there is the dissolved oxygen. So you can see how that goes up and down. The black line is flow in the river. So that can show that there's kind of a steady decline over the June, July, August. The little dashed black line is kind of a low flow threshold that we use. You can see it's well below that at times. That's at 7,000 cubic feet per second. So the lowest we got in flow, this is based on the Mississippi River at St. Paul gauge the USGS runs, but we got down to around 2,000 CFS, which is pretty close to what we saw way back in 1988, which is generally considered, the poster child of droughts. But so down to 2,000, the lowest we saw back in 1988 was 1,060. By the time November came around and into early December, things were, in the maybe 10,000 CFS range. So we had recovered after the drought, but this summertime it got pretty low. And in response to that, what our Metro plant operations, and we work closely with folks like you'll hear from Terry next, so we work closely with Terry Gilchrist, as well as the laboratory and Metro plant operations, but we actually aerate our effluent at Metro plant. So pump it up really high and it cascades down a waterfall, and that actually introduces oxygen back into the effluent. And so that's what those yellow shaded periods are, is where we were aerating our effluent to help protect that dissolved oxygen in the Mississippi River. So that's something that doesn't happen every year, and when it does, it's kind of an all hands on deck thing. So that was a big activity this year, especially at the Metro plant. Next slide, please. So this is kind of zooming out a little bit about, these are the tributary streams and rivers to those larger river systems that we just talked about, but it wasn't much of a different story for them. We do have monitoring in there in the map that you can see based on some of these different watersheds. Some of these we do partner with a watershed district, county. So those are another area where we are partnering. But we did have some of those delays, like I mentioned earlier. We are working with partners. Some of them have different implications of the COVID pandemic. So that was something that was a challenge in 2020. Go to the next slide, please. So here's just an example, throwing some nice pictures there of the beautiful Vermilion Falls and Hastings. But the what water levels, river flows were way low. That's the bar chart on the left just shows this average flow during that June to September time range. So 2021, significantly low compared to previous years. You see from 2013 to 2020, flows were pretty much always above 100 CFS, cubic feet per second, and now the average for that time period in 2021 was below 50. And we do see in the black line a uptick in some of the algal growth, even in the Vermilion River there. This is at the location in Hastings. So similar story, we're seeing it in the large rivers, we're seeing it in the lakes, we saw it in the streams, in river tributaries. So the drought was definitely a big player this past year, and we saw some of that, and we'll be continuing to review all of the data through 2021. Some of these are just kind of preliminary findings right now, and we will have some more to report back in the future. Last slide. Any other questions?
Fascinating. Any questions for Dan? Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dan. This is really interesting. And I'm wondering if you can speak at all about water monitoring that occurs up and downstream on the Mississippi beyond our metropolitan region, and whether or not their findings are similar to ours.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. The upstream monitoring, especially on the Mississippi and Minnesota, is done by the PCA primarily. They have statewide programs. There are data upstream at select locations. We haven't compared to that, but that's a good point. I'll write that down, and we'll definitely connect as we all review our 2021 data. But there are stations, Minnesota River as well, all the way down to Mankato. They've got a robust system of stations down there, so that will be connected with our metro area. And I do know that, because we coordinate a lot with the PCA in terms of we're on calls with them about what are you seeing upstream, what are you seeing downstream, and they're definitely seeing the stagnant water. That Mississippi River picture, I mean, it was probably worse up there in terms of some of that, they're able to walk across the Mississippi in areas they never used to walk across it. So it's definitely being felt further up north for sure in the Mississippi River.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
If I could follow up on another related issue, has it been difficult to find volunteers?
Mr. Chair, committee members, some lakes turn over a volunteer. They might retire. They might move. So I think the sponsoring organizations usually have their lakes that they want. They've prioritized it. They're enrolling them in the program. And it usually falls to them to recruit. We can maybe assist if we have connections, but they usually have the best connections in terms of to the residents that live on the lake and who's engaged, various lake associations and whatnot. So we assist, but it's generally up to them. And there's certain things that they do, and sometimes that we can help with if a volunteer is ill or gets injured. There's things that staff at the local level might be stepping in to do that, but it hasn't been a big problem in the recent years. Sometimes a lake can't be monitored that they've wanted to monitor because they couldn't find one, but they can look at their next priority lake in their watershed type of a thing.
Thank you very much.
So that's how we find the volunteers, is through like lake associations or similar groups.
Yeah, that sponsor is the one whose responsibility is to find their volunteers. And usually they have them lined up kind of ahead of time, saying, if they had a volunteer that was engaged, an engaged scientist, volunteer scientist that they wanted to help with, they'll have that kind of rostered out. And if they, like I said, someone retires, moves away, can't do it physically, then they have to start branching out. I just do know that they utilize lake associations as a good connection. There's a lot of leadership at the local level there.
Councilmember Sterner.
Yes, I was just looking when you went through the presentation that Farquhar Lake and Long Lake in Apple Valley were tainted, and I know back like a decade ago, Long Lake in particular did had a drawdown of the lake, and maybe once or twice. Can you specifically talk about the status of those lakes or what's happening with it? Is it something we're working on to get them into a better situation, or is it just spiraling out of control? In the badness, so to speak. Or
Mr. Chair, committee members, I'd happy to follow up on that. I'll have to probably refer to our limnologist, Brian Johnson, to see if he's aware of the specifics there, or connect with our local connections there. Could you repeat the lakes? I got Long Lake.
Farquhar Lake, they're across the street from each other off of Pilot Knob, just south of Diamond Path, but they're ones on each side of it. They're surrounded by residential, and they have parked by them and such. So Farquhar and Long Lake.
Would be happy to follow up on that for you.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Keep us in the loop. This is something we're very interested in.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. Sometimes I think we had planned on doing this annually. 2020 through one of its many curveballs, but maybe we'll be back next year for another update.
That sounds great. All right. Our next information item, Mississippi Basin, total phosphorus permit update. Terry Gilchrist, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, I'm Terry Gilchrist. I'm an environmental analyst with the Met Council's Environmental Service Health and Safety Group. So I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about our latest permit renewal. It's called the Mississippi Basin Total Phosphorus Permit, or we often call it the umbrella permit. And it's wonderful to be following Dan speaking also, because our permits are often, we get our permits in response to the river conditions, especially conditions in the Mississippi, the Minnesota, and the St. Croix Valley. Next slide, please. The Mississippi Basin Total Phosphorus Permit is nearing reissuance. The draft has been reviewed and approved by Met Council, the public, MPCA, and the EPA. This has been a fairly non-eventful permit renewal process, especially compared to the initial permit issuance, given this was very innovative and a new use of the MPDS framework in Minnesota. I may be telling you a lot of stuff you already know, so bear with me. I don't believe I've presented to you before. But MPDS stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's part of the Clean Water Act structure to maintain and restore the waters of the state. When the MPCA lists a water body as impaired for a specific usage, a number of restoration activities take place. One potential restoration activity is that our Met Council wastewater treatment plant permits may be assigned new or lower limits to reduce the pollutant contributing to the impairment. In the case of total phosphorus, Met Council was facing significant permit reductions at all of our wastewater treatment plants. We were able to work with the MPCA to develop an innovative use of the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permitting program to meet our reduction goals early, strategically, and cost effectively. Normally in permitting, each surface water discharge location, so each of our wastewater treatment plants has its own individual permit. The treatment technology at each plant must meet the discharge requirements specific to that plant and that permit. But this Mississippi Basin Total Phosphorus Permit, or the umbrella permit, and I may use these words interchangeable, treat 5 Met Council wastewater treatment plants, the Metro plant, the Empire plant, the Eagles Point plant, Hastings plant, and Seneca as a combined unit for controlling the discharge of total phosphorus. With the aid of this combined permit, Met Council was able to take a 71% reduction in its permitted phosphorus loading, even though each individual plant was not able to accept a full phosphorus reduction in loading at that time. It often will take a significant capital upgrade to get each plant to where it needs to be for permitting. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background for total phosphorus. In 2002, the MPCA assessed Lake Pepin and found the nutrient levels were too high to meet the state water quality standards designated to ensure that lakes and streams are both fishable and swimmable. The MPCA determined that total phos reductions were required at many wastewater treatment plants in Minnesota, including the Met Council plants, to help reduce the loading to the impaired Lake Pepin and aid in the restoration of its designated uses. You know, as you can see from these dates, the regulatory process can last a very long time. Lake Pepin was declared impaired in 2002, and the regulatory vehicle for to control total phosphorus, it's called the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, was just approved by the EPA this year in May of 2021. But at TMDL issuance, when it's approved and when legally you could put these items in our permit, Met Council had been meeting the TMDL phosphorus loading limits for these 5 plants for 6 years. So that means we've gotten a head start on doing our part in aiding in the restoration of Lake Pepin. Next slide, please. This slide shows a little bit about the framework for total phosphorus reductions outlined in the Lake Pepin TMDL. As you can see, wastewater is listed as 21% of the total phosphorus load. There's going to be many other sources of total phosphorus, and some higher than wastewater. And here, cropland and pasture runoff is a higher load than wastewater. There is ongoing work to reduce the phosphorus from these other sources, but the regulatory framework is not as robust as the MPDS permitting program. So much of the other reduction that's outlined in the TMDL is voluntary. On the right hand of this screen, and I'm sorry, it's a pretty hard to read table, it describes the phosphorus reductions in wastewater treatment plants based on the size of the treatment plant. So the larger plants in Minnesota are required to make the most stringent reductions. And I believe Blue Lake and Metro are our two largest, and they may be the two largest wastewater treatment plants in Minnesota, and they fit in the category of most stringent reduction. And the Metro plant has a special limit, and it is the most stringent limit in all of Minnesota. Some of the very small wastewater treatment plants in rural areas, we're not going to have to make any reductions at all. So, next slide, please. All right, I'd like to just review a few of the highlights of the first and the second terms of this umbrella permit. Just initially, you know, the permit established limits of 71% reduction. So that was the biggest change in the permit. This permit was an innovative permit, and it was really the result of a Met Council MPCA collaboration. MPCA also had to successfully defend this innovative permit in a lawsuit, and they were able to show that the combined permit would be as effective as individual permits in protecting and restoring Lake Pepin. In this first term of the permit, and a permit term is 5 years, we have met the limits of this permit 100% of the time. The permit has allowed Met Council to meet the overall limits, the overall total phosphorus limits as a system of treatment plants before each of its individual plants could meet them separately. And then also during this term, we did an upgrade both at the Hastings plant and the Seneca plant. And so as of this time, all 5 of our plants could meet individual goals. In this second term, and it's not been reissued yet, but all the approvals are in place. The things that I think we're most proud of, we have an innovative model in place for successfully solving difficult environmental problems in collaboration with the MPCA. And that's a model that we may be able to reuse at other times. We have tested the model, and EPA has allowed it to go from being a short-term vehicle to a long-term vehicle. So it's no longer considered a temporary solution. We can keep renewing this permit. We also know that our smaller wastewater treatment plants are protected from permit issues if we have an upset of their phosphorus removal process. And it's going to give us some assurance of what's going to be allowable in the new Hastings wastewater treatment plant. So a lot of certainty has been added to their planning. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide shows kind of how we're doing. Our limit is based on a 12-month rolling average. That green line on top where it says permit limit kind of represents the permit limit. The 5 colors in the graph represent the phosphorus loading from the 5 wastewater treatment plants. You can see that the largest discharge of phosphorus, and this is by weight per year, is from the Metro plant. And that's represented by the blue area. The graph illustrates a number of events that we've experienced over the last 6 years in the first term of this permit. You know, the one, kind of the top ones, if we've met the permit 100% of the time, that's always one of our goals, is 100% compliance with their permit limits. And then you can also see by the end of this year and through this very stringent drought year, we are at historic low phosphorus levels. So even though there was some chlorophyll exceedances that Dan just outlined, we have never put less phosphorus in the river than we are doing this summer. You can also see a few other things. The top green line is our Hastings plant. It used to be a much more pronounced line. You can barely see that top green line because there was an upgrade in the Hastings wastewater treatment plant. Also the light green line is Seneca. And also that bounced around quite a bit. But after a rehabilitation project, you can see after about 2020, it's been very steady, our phosphorus loading from our Seneca plant. And then there's that big bump in about 2020 or 2017, where we came fairly close to exceeding the permit. And you can see that was based on the Metro plant. So we did have some high levels at the Metro plant. We spent, the whole team worked together to bring that down under control. We learned quite a bit about to control this permit. You need to make sure you're watching Metro very closely. Next slide, please.
Terry, just a question on that. What sort of improvements were made at the Metro plant to bring that under control?
Well, what happened once it started going up, it's a 12-month rolling average. So we ended up with a all hands on deck type thing. So we did a number of things all at once. So the Hastings plant was in the process of, putting in its alum system to take out more phosphorus. So that project got accelerated. We also in the sewer shed of the Metro plant, there is a discharger of really high strength phosphorus. So that got taken out of the system. We trucked it somewhere else instead of letting it go to the Metro plant. There's some ways to treat side streams. Normally the Metro plant treats with a biological process, but they treated some side streams with alum. And then we also reviewed our sampling procedures. There was a lot of changes in that too. So we did all these things at the same time. And we turned it around. Hard to say which one did the most, but it was interesting to see a whole team got together and every lever we could find, we pulled.
Thank you.
Yes, and this graph goes out to a number of people every month. So it's got eyes on it all the time. We don't want to be in that situation again. Okay, so it's my last slide. So in partnership with the MPCA, this multi-plant approach allowed us to plan for and execute phosphorus reductions before the TMDL was in place and before each wastewater treatment plant could individually meet proposed requirements. MCS could prioritize the wastewater treatment plants with the most significant reduction opportunities in the basin first. So you can see as if you can link things with the Metro plant, the other ones are so small in comparison, that can be taken care of first, and you can layer in the rest of the work as time allows. Given the success of this permit implementation, EPA has allowed the systems approach to remain in effect and provide future permit certainty at these 5 sites. This helps Minnesota meet the total phosphorus waste load allocation targets at our plants early, which in turn hasten the restoration of Lake Pepin. And that's, the point of all of this is to have clean water. I have to commend the innovative and collaborative staff, both current and retired. There's many people who were key in this work who are no longer at the council, but both here at the council and at the MPCA, who continually find creative ways to work together to benefit public health and the natural resources that make Minnesota such a great place to live. And thank you all for listening to a little bit about one of our 10 permits at Met Council. Next slide, please. Any questions?
Any questions? I just like the message that when we have an all hands on deck approach, when we're seeing that graph go closer and closer to the permit, that's a real call to action and everybody gets on board and that we can bend the curve, literally in this case.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Chair. And also, the eyes are on it all the time now, so hopefully the curve barely moves.
Indeed, Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, this isn't breaking news, but I just thought I'd note that Congresswoman Betty McCollum is authoring the Mississippi River Restoration Initiative, which is modeled in many respects after the Great Lakes Initiative. And it's an initiative that would draw all the states together from Itasca to New Orleans to the Basin. And it would, if all goes well and the monies are appropriated, would provide federal funding to help with restoring our river and keeping it healthy. So I wanted to note that it's an important piece of legislation. It's one that states up and down the Mississippi are working hard on, and I'm excited about it, and I think it bodes well for all of us.
Thank you.
Just to back way up, what would you say for anybody out there that's listening who may be thinking, you know, what's so bad about phosphorus anyways? You know, it seems like a mineral that's important for such and such for human growth. You know, what's so bad about phosphorus? This committee knows that it's bad for algae growth and decreases in oxygen in the water and whatnot. But how would you answer that question, Terry? What's so bad about phosphorus? Why should we care about this?
Yeah, the reason we ended up caring about it, the reason we care about it is that it does cause algae growth. And so the impairment in Lake Pepin was aquatic recreation. There were algal mats all over Lake Pepin. So the fishable, swimmable issue. Both total phosphorus and nitrogen impact that. So at some point, I'm sure we're going to be looking at total nitrogen too.
So if you care about fish, if you care about fishing, if you care about aquatic life in our rivers and our lakes, then you should care about phosphorus.
Right. Care about boating, any of that.
And
Yes.
boating, yeah, right. Basically all those things that many of us like to do in the summertime and wintertime. Thank you. Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't remember the slide, but you referenced, I think it was in the early 2000s, that Lake Pepin was basically put on a critical list or you know, needing some action. And can you just say more about why it would take 2 decades for a process to play out? And you know, I work for a labor union that is for projects that create jobs, as long as it's done in a responsible way. And a lot of times we're frustrated by the processes that delay projects sort of years and years, and in this case, decades. So just curious to hear your thoughts on the process.
Oh, thank you so much for the question. I'm going to have to tell you, I've been here 6 years, so I wasn't here at the beginning of the process. But when a lake is impaired, and you can go back and look at that map and see how huge that map is, it covered almost all of Minnesota. At the end of the day, you're going to ask almost all of Minnesota to do very significant work on total phosphorus reduction. So there'll always be pushback. So there'll be pushback, and then there'll be a lot of work to create this thing called a total maximum daily load. So that it's impaired, the lake is impaired, and then the group at MPCA has to figure out what's causing the impairment and who is contributing to it. So that little round graph saying wastewater treatment plants were 21%, cropland was 30-some%. That took a significant amount of study and work to do. And then there was also significant modeling. So there's a significant scientific process and a significant political process. I believe this is a very long process, so longer than normal.
Yeah, that jumped out to me as well. This was identified in 2002, and 19 years later, we're going to really get to it. Like,
But
I understand the long scientific process is probably just as much of the political process that delayed things.
maybe Lisa has more insight on this.
Well, I can say a piece of that was after the 1988 low flow, phosphorus is so ubiquitous, it's pretty much, and that pie chart that Terry showed indicates that it comes from all different sources. And so there was a fair amount of effort to do some very specific monitoring of the sewer sheds or the different streams contributing into the Minnesota River, for example, to determine where is it all coming from. Because if you really got aggressive with one source and you didn't consider the other sources, you wouldn't accomplish anything. And so that's where these loads and figuring out what all could be reduced and where the most significant impact and affordability comes into it. So some of those small plants aren't going to be adding treatment to take out phosphorus, but their flow is low enough that their load overall isn't so great. So, PCA is trying to figure out from a systems perspective, what's the best ways that we can address the problem. And, it takes a little bit of information and facts and science to figure out. And I think it's been good that they do that so we can tackle that affordability, that we don't have folks paying for something that could be better met with efforts in another area.
Thank you.
Good point. Other questions? Terry, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all.
Appreciate it. All right, have a great afternoon. And that takes us to our third information item, which is the federal fiscal year 2021 EPA report summary for environmental services. Ms. Payne.
Thank you, and good afternoon,
Welcome.
Chair and council members. I am here to present the council's federal fiscal year 2021 disadvantaged business enterprise report for the Environmental Protection Agency. And you can move to the next slide, please. And just for a frame of reference, this report is based on the federal fiscal year, which begins on October 1st of 2020 and runs through September 30th of 2021. And it covers all projects funded with federal funds from the Environmental Protection Agency dispersed through the Public Facilities Authority. We have a 3-year triennial goal that runs from 2021 through 2023 that is reported and monitored annually. And our goal is 11% DBE participation on those Metropolitan Council environmental services projects that receive federal funds. And these projects, of course, include construction, architectural and engineering, and professional technical projects. Also, I'll mention for any folks that are familiar with other DBE reports that the council does provide, such as our FTA DBE report, our EPA DBE report differs, one, because it's based off of payments as opposed to commitments. And then also in 2019, the Environmental Protection Agency did away with the fair share, where we were reporting on both DBE, or minority business enterprises, and women business enterprise separately. However, the council and the Office of Equal Opportunity still breaks that information out because it does provide us an opportunity to really analyze the data relative to equity and other factors that we can look into and analyze the data. Next slide, please. So just for bottom line, our goal again was 11%. We just fell short of that at 10.58% utilization this reporting period. And you can see how that's broken down between minority business enterprise, MBE, and women business enterprise, WBE. And just in terms of why we might think we fell a little bit short, there was, I think this might be counterintuitive to a lot of people, but there was $30 million more in 2021 that was dispersed than in 2020. And, you know, intuitively, you might think, well, then the DBE numbers should grow as well. But as we know, as the projects get bigger and larger, it's harder for smaller businesses to compete and have the capacity to perform on the project. So once they get bigger and more complex, it has a tendency to have the opposite effect for our smaller businesses. Next slide, please. This slide just shows that the disaggregated information relative to how those payments were dispersed over the federal fiscal year. And actually, this slide actually is more encouraging than it has been in the past. Normally, or in the past, Caucasian women have made up 80 to 90% of the spend. And this time around, it's just more equitably distributed. They're at about 67% of the total spend. Next slide, please. This slide is just gives an idea in terms of how many firms are certified in the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Directory, and how they're dispersed in the Metro, Greater Minnesota, and those outside of Minnesota. And then kind of shows that along with the payments that were dispersed. It just kind of gives you an idea of, okay, how many businesses are certified that are owned by Black Americans or Hispanic Americans? And then how did that manifest itself on our projects? Next slide, please. So some of the highlights that we identified from the report, of course, was our spend with Black American DBEs was over 5 times higher in 2021 than in 2020. And then one of the things and one of the focuses of our strategic plan in terms of bringing in and introducing new firms into the environmental services realm. 2 of the firms had never worked on environmental services projects prior to this year. So that shows us that some of our efforts in this area are making a difference. And then also USA Freak entered into a mentor protege agreement with Rice Lake Construction, and they had never worked with the council, period, not let alone environmental services, and have really benefited from their relationship with Rice Lake. They had 205,000 spend in our federal program, but also they've up over 2 million just in total participation on council projects, local and federal combined. And that was after not having any relationship at all with this firm at the council.
What sort of business do they do, Ashanti? What service do they provide?
They do what we call road and street. Well, they do concrete mostly, is their, I would say their wheelhouse, but they do other things. But I would say concrete is the number one thing.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Also, our spend with minority DB suppliers was over 3 times higher than 2021. And $60,000 again was spent with a Black-owned firm by the name of B&L Supply. And again, they had no relationship or had not had any previous experience on environmental services projects prior to this year. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we have been working on have been in place and in some cases made progress on. Targeted outreach, again, trying to make those connections to folks and introduce them into opportunities within environmental services and those types of projects. And I think we've had some results in terms of reaching new firms. We've recently had some meet and greet events. We did one with around HVAC firms that went really well and received very well. And the business unit wants to do more of these. The meet and greets are conducted sometimes with the business unit and certified small businesses, and sometimes they're business unit certified small businesses, and then longer established larger firms that typically hold prime contracts with us. And then also mentor protege, that has been a really good tool to provide experience, technical expertise, and capacity to smaller businesses. We are partnering with other government and entities within our region, including MnDOT, Department of Administration, Metropolitan Airports Commission, and the City of Minneapolis to conduct a mentor protege information and mixer that will be on January 19th. We also have made some changes to our contract initiation memo and goal setting process because that is the tool or the ground level spot and component where we establish specific and individual project goals that have subcontracting requirements. The Office of Equal Opportunity has also has a new unit, the Engagement and Development Unit, which will help us reach and have an impact beyond just regulation and compliance, because we also know that we have to go beyond just our normal regulation and compliance activities to achieve some of our objectives and goals. We also have a new data team that's working with all divisions and others involved in the reporting process to help gather data more efficiently, more effectively, and more clearly. And then the Advancing Equity grants that were disseminated earlier this year. Through our strategic plan, we have identified several projects that we will use those funds to build capacity, help us identify gaps where we don't have certified small businesses to perform, provide training, technical assistance, and access to resources. And with that, I think next slide, I am done, and I would welcome any questions, Mr. Chair and Council and committee members.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Any questions out there? Yeah, council member, go ahead. Councilmember Zirin, I saw you first and then Sterner.
Thank you, Chair Lindstrom. I want to click back to slide 5. Total number of DBEs by ethnicity and location. Ashanti, can you help me understand this slide? Okay, so you got.
Yes. So the way that if I'm a prime bidder and there is a DBE goal on a project, the one place that I can go to locate and find DBEs is the Minnesota Unified Certification Program directory. and that's operated by the Metropolitan Council. And this is just a breakdown by ethnicity in terms of who's certified in that directory and the firms that I would have to choose from if I was trying to meet a goal on a project. And it's also broken down by Metro District, and then Greater Minnesota, and then disadvantaged business enterprises that are located outside of the state of Minnesota.
Okay. When I first looked at, I appreciate that clarification. When I first looked at that chart, my mind was going in a direction that was not. For some reason, I was looking at it as percentage of businesses that were certified, but that's not what this is. Thank you for the clarification.
Good question. Other questions? Oh yeah, Councilmember Sterner.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, when I'm looking at the chart, the screen, the one right before that one, we're seeing like minority women, and we basically were like hearing crickets on that. So I think we need to be working harder with minority women, like you see, like this one Hispanic woman firm. Otherwise, it's all Caucasian, women on that. So I think to really be focused on it. I'm not sure by trading Caucasian men to Caucasian women is really getting to where we want to be in that end. But I also see the advantage of having more women in our trades areas. The other question I have is unrelated to this one, is I've been contacted by a couple DBE companies, like one local one who's a supplier, and he's having a hard time like getting into it. So one of his questions was, if we have some of the contractors that are using a supplier that would qualify, does that help their numbers, or is the suppliers totally separate, where when we have our contractors that they qualify, none of that goes in it? They could buy stuff from China or Canada or wherever, or from any business that doesn't help their numbers, or what does that help their numbers if they use a business that qualifies for DBE as a supplier?
Councilmember Sterner, Chair. Great question. Yes, supply, and if we could pull up slide number 3. Supplies is definitely a significant part of this process and how goals are achieved and met on our projects. If you look there, supplies represent a little bit, let's see, 1.2, my quick little math there, 1.2 million approximately of the spend. Of course, the most spend is in construction, and slightly more than supplies is professional services. But yes, supplies is definitely applicable and can be used. A DBE supplier is definitely can be used to fulfill goals and meet objectives.
Okay, and then can qualified businesses come to that meet and greet on the 19th? And if so, how do they get a whole invitation to that event and the specifics of it?
They can contact me directly, and I can get them to the right individual. That work is being led by our engagement and development unit, specifically Thomas Mabratu, again in coordination with others.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for your work. Appreciate the presentation.
Councilmember Sterner, the business that you were working with, they were having a hard time getting onto the directory. Is that right? The DBE?
Well, they were actually got on the directory, but then it was like, then they were bidding, but it was a hard time like know when the bids were or what they could offer. And then when they did it, they were getting really small quantities, bid on, things like that. A few different, things, or finding out like where the opportunities are, all those type of stages.
Very good. Other questions, comments? Thank you so much. Appreciate the update and
Thank you.
keep us on the loop, keep us in the loop, and crossing our fingers that these initiatives pay dividends.
Thank you.
All right, that takes us to the general manager's report. Lisa.
Ready to close out 2021. Another excellent year for compliance. Happy to report that despite all the disruptive things that are happening in the world that creep into our workplace, our employees are still strongly committed to meeting our compliance. On a second note, the presentation that Terry did today and talked about our total phosphorus, where we have this umbrella permit. You know, our motivation in doing that was the collective ability for us to manage and still keep track of contributing less phosphorus to the river while we stage our different improvements to our plants, for example. But one of the unexpected benefits is the impact on the collective efforts. And I think it gets back to what Council Member Vento was referring to about the Mississippi River, bringing that all together. So it's really clear that collectively, how much are those plants contributing in phosphorus? And you can see that we're at the lowest levels we've ever been. And I think that's that teamwork impact and effort of seeing the bottom line when all of it's added together, how much are we contributing to that river? And if you keep it separate by plants, you don't have that same feeling of pulling together to get the best score you can as a group. So I think it's a lesson learned in systems thinking. Clearer we can see how well the goal is being met and that our collective efforts are a part of being seen, that we can have a much bigger impact. And I think that comes true for a lot of the challenges in the region. And equity is actually one of those areas as well. So I think we've got a really good year ahead of us in 2022. I think we're well positioned for that teamwork to continue to grow and build so that we can have, with your partnership, a very positive legacy that you can leave for this region. So thank you for all the support in 2021, and I'm really looking forward to 2022.
As am I. Councilmember Zirin.
Yeah, thank you. Something that's been rolling around in my head from the beginning of that presentation is a question for you, GM Thompson. Who in the world would sue to challenge this permit? I have no idea.
I think there actually was references when we first started looking at phosphorus in this way. And I think it was because of groups looking at the problem needing to get addressed. So kind of back to Councilmember Ferguson's comments. Why is it taking us so long to really get phosphorus improvements to the degree that we're seeing it today? And I think the worry was because there's a way to regulate dischargers that are permit source or point sources. And then there's that runoff realm of non-point sources, and there's not a permit and a way to start to turn the knob to reduce that. There are a lot of programs that are, you know, coming to light to work on improving those, of course, but those have taken time to develop. And so I think the initial threats for lawsuits was to make sure those that could be controlled, you know, do as much as they possibly can. And PCA was taking a much more pragmatic approach to looking at, we need to address this as the larger issue, and to consider things like the timing and how much load does each take care of. So I think we've been really fortunate that PCA has taken that more of a system thinking view of this. But those that were worried that it wasn't going to get addressed if we didn't do everything we could already have available as a tool, were wanting to sue to make it happen. Hope that got to your question.
Councilmember Sterner?
I just wanted to add, I mean, I think a lot of times being on like the Clean Water Council, I think we talk about these issues because there's everybody's got their foot at the table or their bite at the table, whether you're in agriculture or DNR or PCA, and have those conversations really makes a big thing because we have industry there, we have environmental groups and that. And I think it's a nice way to have that conversation, and I think we really make big changes in that. And we look for solutions too, from Department of Health to the University of Minnesota to come up what we can do. And of course, Metropolitan Council is a big part of that with our experts on that, the council and the committee to make changes that way. So I think it's really a good system. It's nonpartisan, and we have both Republican and Democrats from the House and the Senate on there. So I'm really honored to be represent the committee, and I see a lot of big changes just through this committee. So thank you.
And that's the Clean Water Council?
Yep. The Clean Water Council, yep.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Fantastic.
another example to pull out is that the slide that showed when we are adding oxygen to our effluent because the river dissolved oxygen is low due to the low flows. That's not because our effluent isn't meeting its discharge requirements. It's because the river is in trouble. And so we're doing something to help the environment as a result of adding dissolved oxygen. And it just shows that we have the capacity to do things like that. And it's a very good thing for the environment to be able to have that be done. So just an example of us as an organization going beyond what could be argued as our responsibility.
And is that a mechanical process to add that dissolved oxygen, or is it just the waterfall? Or both?
Yeah, they're pumping the water up, and through the cascading down, it adds oxygen.
It's the cascading that does that. Okay. Good.
A lot of pumped water to raise that elevation.
Indeed. Well, thanks, everybody. Great presentations, great information, good questions. I think we can call it a meeting.
Hope everybody has a good holiday season.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good meeting.